Okay, so I'm going to say something that's related really to next parsha and last parsha. In other words, the parsha we read yesterday and the parsha we're about to read. Why am I saying it? Because it's related to last week and this week. It's related to us because at this point, Rebecca tells Isaac to tell Jacob to go to Haran to get married, to marry from his family. And we know the end of the story. It takes him 20 years to come back, right? So it's mother says, go for a little while, and I'll call you when your brother calms down, right? So that's what we're going to read in a few minutes. But it turns out that it's 20 years, and 20 years is obviously a chunk of time. So what I want to do is I want to read a commentary that asks, it's really talking about last week's parsha. In last week's parsha, you have Eliezer, who was dispatched to go and get a wife for Isaac, a generation earlier. And there, he keeps on asking God for God's kindness. And he keeps repeating, Aseh chesed, God, do kindness, do kindness. It sounds like it's like the ultimate kindness, like, well, we're asking for something that is so great. And we need divine kindness. And his question, so this is from a Hasidic commentary, not Chabad, but a Hasidic commentary. And he says, what's the big deal? Abraham is a wealthy guy. Abraham is a famous person. What's so bad? What's the big kindness necessary for someone to agree to want to marry into his family? Right? It's not like nobody ever migrated before. What's this big kindness? So that's what he asks. I'm just going to read it a little bit, try to translate. He says, what's the big deal? What's the big rush? What's the big noise? What's the big tumult that Eliezer has to pray to God and ask for kindness as if it's something that is completely unusual for somebody to want to marry into Abraham's family? Even though Abraham was very well known, as we read last week's parsha, the people say, Nasi Elokim ata b'tocheinu, you are Prince of God in our midst. And you would imagine that many people would want to marry Isaac's family, right? And if you're going to say, and in fact, the verse says that when Eliezer prays, he says, Aseh chesed im Adoni Abraham, do kindness with my master Abraham. And the Medrash says even Abraham needs kindness. When a person prays, you should pray for kindness, etc., etc. So his question, he goes on about the question. And then he says like this, then he gets Kabbalistic, and he says, contrast the story with Eliezer, and then contrast that to the next generation, which we're about to read, which is when Jacob goes to Haran, to his mother's family to marry his wives. That takes no less than 20 years. So it's really 14, and then 20. He has to work 7 years for Rachel, and then he's tricked, and his father-in-law gives him Leah, and then he works then he marries Rachel, and he works another 7 years for Rachel. So he ends up working for 14 years, plus he ends up staying another 6 years. So that was that. So he says, let's compare those two stories. What do you see in that story? So you could say, why did he have to stay so long? Say because his father-in-law wasn't nice. He made him work for so long to earn the right to marry. But the Shemi Shmuel, the Kabbalistic commentary, says like this. He says it's much deeper than that. Because when it takes so long to work in the physical sense, one of the principles of the Kabbalistic perspective is that the physical is really just the physical is just a reflection of the spiritual. So it represents that, spiritually speaking, it's very hard to extract the souls of Rachel and Leah from their environment, from their natural environment. Why? So the Kabbalah explains as follows, that we know that everything in the unholiness does not have a source of vitality on its own, right? There's no God and Satan, right? Everything comes from God. So even the holiness gets its life from even the unholiness gets its life from holiness, gets its vitality and energy from holiness. Because God has this sort of certain energy that is given to the unholiness to allow it to exist, because it needs to exist, because if it doesn't exist, there's no free choice, there's no balance of good and evil in the world, there's no free choice. So the Kabbalistic doctrine is that there's sparks of God that are sort of entrapped and in exile within the unholiness, and to give it life. And at some point, slowly but surely, those energies start coming back to holiness. And as they come back to holiness, the negativity dissipates, because the negativity doesn't have its own source of vitality. So if you take out the vitality, the holiness sparks, then they're going to disappear. And that's the way it works. And over time, more and more holiness comes back. This is related to the concept that The Talmud says that the Jewish people were sent to exile. Why were the Jews scattered to every corner of the earth? If you think about the exile just as being a punishment, so you can exile them from Israel, like it was after the first temple. After the destruction of the first temple, Jews were exiled from Israel. And where did they go to? Primarily, they were in one place. They went to Babylonia, maybe a few in Egypt, but primarily Babylonia. And then when you come to the second temple, the Jews are scattered to the entire earth. So the Talmud says, why would the Jews scatter to the entire earth? So the answer is, Hashem performed a kindness. There's different answers, different interpretations. One is to give us protection, to hedge. If people in one area are persecuted, the Jews will survive elsewhere. So that's one interpretation. That's more of a practical, political perspective. But there's a spiritual perspective, which is the Jewish people were scattered throughout the earth so that the converts would join. Jews reach every corner, influence people, and those converts, those souls come back to Judaism. Now, the mystics explain that it's not just converts, the people that converted, it's also the energy, the sparks, all forms that they will join, come back to holiness. So in other words, that's a well-known Kabbalistic concept. So what the Shemi Shmuel says, he says like this, he says, Rachel and Leah, their holiness, and obviously they're holy souls, of course, and they're in the environment of Haran, which is a negative environment. And what happens is that there's resistance to allow those sparks to leave, because consciously or subconsciously, probably subconsciously, that area doesn't want to release the sparks of the holiness, those holy souls, to come back, to leave, because they feel they're going to be losing some of their vitality and some of their energy. So the natural state would be to extract a holy soul from an unholy environment. It takes work, it takes time. And when Jacob is working for 14 years, he's not just working in simple sense to get his father-in-law's permission, but it's also mystical work. It's difficult to extract the sparks. Now he says, now you know what's the big kindness. The fact that Eliezer was able to extract Rebekah's from that environment, same environment, just one generation earlier, so quickly, took one day instead of taking 14 years. That is that is an unbelievable kindness that God shows to Abraham specifically. So by contrasting the two stories, you see that with Eliezer was kindness because naturally it's a big deal. Naturally, it takes 14 years. Then it took another 6 years after that because they needed to get some sheep, whatever. That's we'll read about in this coming parsha. But again, you don't realize how unusual last week's parsha is until you read next week's parsha. So you realize the 14 years. So that is just a little bit to connect last week's parsha to this week's parsha and to next week's parsha, and it's all the same theme. So it also helps us understand that when there are challenges in the physical world, it's not just we're living on multiple planes at the same time. There's physical difficulty. He has to please his father-in-law, but it also represents the spiritual difficulty to extract the holy sparks. And it goes on and on and on. I don't want to. This could be here all day, but this helps explain. I'm going to feel bad talking about yesterday's contract, but it helps explain why Abraham dispatched Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac. Why doesn't Isaac? You have an obligation to marry. The mitzvah's upon you. You need your old father to send Eliezer. You look for a match. Especially he wasn't a young child then. To do the math, how old was Isaac? Isaac was almost 40 when he got married, right? So you'd expect that he should be able. So he should, because he was 37 at the Akedah, and he got married. No, the verse says clearly. The verse says in this week's parsha, by this week's parsha, if you look at Genesis, page 125, the opening phrase of this week's parsha, verse 2, Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah. Black on white. You don't need the calculations in Rashi to say that the binding was 37. He's 40 years old, clearly. That's a clear, explicit verse. So the question is, why can't he dispatch Eliezer? Why does his father have to dispatch Eliezer? So the Kabbalists say, well, very simple. When it comes to Isaac is judgment and Abraham is kindness. That's their spiritual makeup. So judgment means to earn, whereas kindness is God goes beyond what the person deserves. So if Isaac would dispatch Eliezer, then the energy behind this mission is you have to earn the right to take Rebecca back to Israel, that may take 7 years. The fact that it was initiated by Abraham, and Abraham represents kindness, means that the energy of that mission is a mission of kindness, and therefore it can happen immediately in the same day, and it doesn't have to take 7 years. So that's just a little bit about last week's parsha. Now we can go back to where we're up to in the narrative, which is the last couple of verses of Toldot, and then we go to Vayetze, Isaac leaving, Jacob leaving his hometown and going to the land of Haran to find a wife and to escape his brother's wrath. Genesis chapter 28, I guess, page 143. I guess we can be 27 a little bit. On the ArtScroll, it's page 143 or 141. I'm going to share the screen in a minute, so everybody can get a little peek at this.
Rabbi Feldman, can I ask you a quick follow-up question for previous idea that you stated? I couldn't figure out how to raise hand.
Oh, okay, no worries.
Yeah, but I just didn't want to distract. Tell me if it's going to take too long. I will talk offline. The idea about extracting the sparks, is it possible to apply it to one person, that one person is a mix of negativity and spark? So how does that work within one person? Because if you try to extract a spark, where does the energy will come from? If you extract a spark, would the other disappear?
So
if it's too complicated, we'll just
if you extract the spark, the negativity disappears. In other words, if you look at the Kabbalah, one of the big questions is, where does evil come from? Forget about evil. Where does multiplicity come from? You start from God. God is one. Everything is holy. Where do you get something outside of God if God is everywhere? Right? That's the basic question. The question is, how do you get from the infinite God to creation multiplicity and creation and negativity? So what's the Kabbalistic system? Kabbalistic system is that there's a whole elaborate order of chains of worlds that allows for the concealment of the infinity and the creation of many levels and stages until you get to a place that is multiple and distant, doesn't sense godliness. Okay, so that's the model. Then beyond that model, you also have negativity. So where does negativity come from? So you have in other words, a neutral world. The neutral world is the world where you don't sense the divine presence, but it's not necessarily negative. And then you have evil. So where does evil come from? And again, everything must come from God, because there cannot be another source of existence. Right? We always talk about this, that most theologies, at least the theologies that believe, theologies that had to deal with the question of where does evil come from, most theologies, they'll separate the evil from God. They say, well, God is responsible for all the good, and the negativity that happens in the world is not because of God, either because God is not functioning, not aware, doesn't care, or because there's an evil in the world, its own independent source of power, which is evil. And that's Satan, and there could be a conflict between good and evil, between God and the forces of unholiness. That's how they protect God against evil. How does God allow evil to happen? It's not God. It's the source of negativity. We can't say that because we say God is one. God is responsible for everything. So again, where does evil come from? So, what the Kabbalistic interpretation is, in other words, to explain this in Kabbalistic through the Kabbalistic model. You have what they call klipat noga, which is the peel, and it's light as in it has some light. And then you have neutral phenomenon in this world represents that you have possibility for holiness. So there's a spark of holiness. And then you have something that's not holy. It's not negative. It's not holy. Klipat noga. Now, this klipat noga allows the fact that there can be a spark that's mixed into neutral allows for it to descend and then become negativity, because ultimate negativity has to have some place for it to get life from godliness. And sort of the bridge is this klipa of light. There's neutral. The neutral, so you have holy, you have neutral, klipat noga, the Kabbalists refer to the klipat, it's the peel that has some light in it. And then that becomes the energy for the three unholy klipot. Now, if you get rid of the middle bridge, in other words, if the neutral becomes holy, what will happen to the unholiness is it will disappear. Now, the question is, what does it mean to disappear? So you could say it will cease to exist, maybe. It could also mean it will cease to be negative. It'll be transformed. So there's different ways of what the Kabbalists would call birur, refinement. What is refinement? And the Kabbalistic terminology, Kabbalistic vocabulary, correction is refinement. You say you have to correct something, it's refine it. Livarer, to refine. What is refine? Or birur is really, it's also the same word for refine, is also selecting. Borer, on Shabbat, you're not allowed to select the good from the bad. That's called borer, to select. What does that mean? If you're going to get into the mix, pull out the good and separate the good from the bad, that is correction. How is that a correction? Because you're not just saving the holy spark, but by saving the holy spark, the unholy, what was left as unholy, cannot exist. What's going to happen to it? So either it will disappear, or it will have to become holiness because it has no source of independent life. Now, this happens on a cosmic scale. This happens on a historic scale. Not every time we contribute to this process do we see the result. But ultimately, this is what's going to happen. That's what happens at the end of the day, at the end of days, when the prophets say that the spirit of unholiness will be removed from the land, from the earth, which means because the sparks that are mixed into the unholiness are now brought back to holiness. And everybody has a small little part in this process. And eventually you get to this tipping point where this is felt on a cosmic scale. Part of this is when the righteous came and extract holy souls from the unholiness. And it's not just the patriarchs, but there's Medrash talks about there are some of the greatest Jewish sages, Talmudic sages, were converts, and some of the greatest prophets were converts. And it's understood that when you take a convert out of this negative culture, something has to change. Either that culture has to cease to exist, or hopefully it has to cease to be negative, because it doesn't have that spark of holiness yet left to give it vitality in its negative form. Yes.
Which prophets were converts?
Ovadia the prophet was a prophet from Ger Adomi. He was an Edomite, and his prophecy is an attack on Edom. So you took the Medrash makes this point that you took a person or a convert or a soul from Edom, and that is really the downfall of Edom, or you could reinterpret that to be the downfall of the negativity of Edom, right? Because again, when you take out the spark, what happens? What's left? Either it disappears or it ceases to be negative.
So how do they work Ovadia with Rome? Do they work with that?
Ovadia, the Ger Adomi, yeah. So he's a descendant of Edom, and at least the rabbis believe that Rome represented Edom, either literally, that some of the leaders of Rome were literally migrants from Edom, which is Esau's descendants, or figuratively that it was the cultural influences. So again, the idea that the ability to be able to refine a certain culture usually has to come from that culture itself. The transformation comes from its grassroots. That's really what it's saying. It's only somebody from Edom could refine Edom, could really understand it and tackle the core of its negativity. And you have that in different areas. That the Zohar has a statement that you say, the Zohar, I think it's about this exact phenomenon that about Ovadia, says that if you want to chop down the forest, not that it's a good idea, but you want to chop down a tree, you take from the forest, you take the handle for the axe that will chop down the forest.
Say that again?
From the forest, you get the handle for the axe that will chop down the forest.
And why do you need to do that?
Because that's an observation. But what the observation represents is sometimes to transform a certain culture, it cannot be done from the outside. It has to be done from the inside, right? Sometimes your vaccine, you want to have a vaccine for a virus. Sometimes you take the virus itself, and the virus itself represents the cure, right? Sometimes the culture itself, the negativity itself, could be manipulated and corrected, but something from the outside cannot always fix it. You need someone from the inside, from within, to be able to create the proper transformation.
And who are the great scholars who are converts?
You have a lot. Ashmaya, Naftalion, Shammai, and Hillel's teachers were converts, and they're not super well known, but they're that they're really the parents of most of the Torah, because Hillel and Shammai were some of the greatest sages, and they received Torah from Shmai and Avtalion. Rabbi Akiva was a son of converts, and right here we're looking at Onkelos, the translator.
He's
He's
convert.
legitimate to Rome, yeah. So it's not unusual for some of the greatest, and these are people who were in pivotal times. Rabbi Akiva lived in a time, because of the Roman persecution, that he really reestablished the oral Torah. All the great sages of the Mishnah are his students. So the Talmud says that, well, this Mishnah is this part of the Mishnah, this part of literature is based on this rabbi, and the Sifra is another rabbi, and the Sifri, the Medrashim, it attributes every Medrash to a certain sage, and it says all of that is according to Rabbi Akiva. In other words, all the literature that all the basic texts that we have in the oral Torah, the Mishnah, and the Medrashim are all based on the teachings of the students of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva himself is the son of a convert. And the same thing, if you go earlier, you have Hillel and Shammai, descendants of Shmai and Avtalion. Students of Shmai and Avtalion who were converts. Yes.
Question for you then. So if Akiva is the son of converts, and Akiva was not taught anything till he was 40, were his parents sincere converts?
Yeah, because they weren't he was illiterate because of poverty. He didn't have the opportunity to study because he was poor, so he had to work. So it wasn't a question of that they were rejecting the Torah. If you see what I'm saying.
Poor people learn Torah, no?
Sometimes poor people were able to learn Torah, but sometimes, especially in that time with this Roman persecution, Israel was not Judaism. Israel was not it wasn't so easy. So when it becomes difficult, then obviously the people with the means have more access. And
So do we have the backstory of Akiva's parents?
I don't know how much of it we do. I don't know.
Because they converted and they didn't teach their son Torah.
The conversion means that you're accepting the faith and the practices, but the scholarship, you needed a much bigger commitment of time. It's not even like today where you can just you go and buy the book and put it in your library and you can read it over time. There's no books. You have to show up in person to study, and you have to put in a tremendous amount of effort. There's no written Torah. Everything you have to say, repeat. Every sentence you learn, you have to review 100 times, right? It's a big commitment of time and investment, and not everybody had the means to do that. And later on, it was later on that you say it could be it was a little bit before, but it was that period that the sages instituted that even people that there should be free public school in Israel. So I think it's the first free public school system that we know of. The Talmud describes that it used to be that if the Torah says, teach a Torah to your children. So if somebody had children, the father would teach him. If he didn't have children, if he didn't have a father, or your father was ignorant, you wouldn't study. At a certain point, the sages said that there should be in every county, there should be a school. And it's the community's responsibility to educate the children. And then they made it not only every county, because not everyone had the means to travel, they made it every city. But that was a transformation. And again, this Rabbi Akiva specifically is living in a time where there was persecution, so it wasn't so simple.
Wasn't Hillel born in poverty too?
Hillel was born in poverty, yes, but Hillel was also a descendant. He came from a very illustrious family. He was from the house of David, so they had other, social capital or other
But
advantages.
doesn't he come from Babylonia to Israel, and he comes as a poor guy?
He does, but he has that prestige of his family, so he has that awareness and the sensitivity, and he probably heard, if your father is learned, even if you're poor, it's more likely that you will have a foundation. That would be my guess, because one of the things. So he was from a very illustrious family. He was 10 generations from Ezra, who rebuilt the second temple. So he was a
Yeah, but that kind of illustrates my earlier question that the transformation happens not only in a historical level, but also within each person. So by taking somebody from a different environment, I mean, not everything is black and white. So there are some sparks that need to be transformed within the same person.
Correct. And how fast does that transformation take? So you look at the story and you look at what we're doing is we're contrasting two parshas. The parsha before us, Eliezer shows up, takes Rebecca in 1 second, in 1 day, they're out of town. Next story we're about to read is that Jacob wants to do the same thing. He's just looking for a shidduch. He shows up, he comes with 14 years, he takes him 14 years to build a family, really 20 years to build a family. So what happened? You say, well, the circumstances were different. Wasn't that different? If you think about it, Lavan, the same character, was the brother of Rebecca, who allows Rebecca to go with Eliezer immediately. And the same guy, when it comes to his daughters, no, he just makes more and more obstacles. So what's the dramatic change? So then it just makes it even the contrast even greater. Here it takes a day, here it takes 20 years.
Once he's a young man,
He doesn't care about his sister, he cares about his daughters.
He doesn't have the power that he has as a.
Well, they needed his permission. Because first it was the father, and the father dies. The tradition is the father dies, because in the middle of the conversation, first is the father, mother, and then it's the mother and brother.
Right.
So the father's dead, the brother has the power. He could have put in obstacles, there's no question. So you could say he doesn't care about his sister, care about his daughters. It's very rational. You could rationalize this. Again, this is not, you could just say it's a simple story. Why do we complicated stories? He wanted his son-in-law to work for him in a family business. He didn't want to let him go. So it's not a big question here. It makes sense when you read it on the simple level. But the Kabbalists are saying, if you're stuck somewhere, if you're there, and if there's challenges, and if it's difficult, understand that it's not just because you have a father-in-law who's trying to take advantage of you, it's that too, but it could also be a spiritual transformation taking place. And maybe you have to do something here, and you have to extract sparks, and sometimes extracting sparks is very difficult. And the more intense the sparks are, the more the people don't want to let go of those sparks. Okay, I'm jumping topics. There is a story, if you look at the 4th book, the Torah, and you go to Numbers, you read the story that when the Jewish people are coming back to Israel, they leave Egypt and they 40 years in the desert, and they're about to approach Israel, there's this problem. What's the problem? Moab, the king of Moab, is frightened. So he hires Bilam to curse the Jews. And we have a full parsha about the story. Goes nowhere. He wants to curse the Jews, instead of he ends up blessing the Jews. But it's a very strange story. It doesn't advance the plot. It's like, okay, so what do I care? This guy had an issue. He wanted to curse the Jews. It doesn't directly involve an episode or a plot with the Jewish people. So what is it doing there? So there's a lot of interpretations. One of the questions about that story is they were frightened. They were by Israel. They were frightened by the Jewish people. Why were they so afraid? The Jewish people were told that we're not allowed to attack Moab. Moab was our cousins. If you remember the story from a few weeks ago, they were the descendants of Lot. Lot is Abraham's nephew. We don't start with Moab. So why is Moab so afraid? So the short answer is that they were not afraid of a direct attack of the Jewish people, but they were afraid that they were the most prominent kingdom in the area, and they were afraid that if the Jewish people show up, they're going to, what do they call it? They call it a talent drain or
brain drain.
Brain drain. There's going to be a brain drain from Moab to Israel. In other words, there's a competition. They're going to, instead of investing in the stock market in Moab, people are going to want to get jobs in Tel Aviv. That's what they were afraid of. But it's not a joke. They also, but mystically, spiritually is the same point. The spiritual souls of Moab are going to go to Jewish people. And were they right? Of course. Because Ruth goes from Moab to Israel, and her descendant is King David. Right? So you see that there is an effect. When there are spark souls that are drawn to other countries, to Israel from the surrounding nations, and there's resistance. The people sense that if there'll be a competing culture, some of our best and brightest may migrate. Now you could say in a physical, they were afraid for the economy, but also on a mystical point, you could say that there's some of the spiritual talent will go and be refined. So this, all I'm trying to say is that this theme is a theme that Kabbalists come back to, but it also applies to every person's individual life. If I'm experiencing a challenge, and I have something that I thought will take me 10 minutes instead of taking me an extended period of time, you could say, well, things are not working out, okay, it's just difficulties. Or you could say, there's something here that has to be worked out. There's some spiritual resistance, and my being here, I'm helping refine and extract a certain energy that doesn't want to be released because the negativity is holding on to it, because this is so valuable. So the fact that there's difficulties represents that perhaps what I'm doing here is so valuable that the more valuable the soul or the spark is, the less the forces of negativity want to let go of it. That's how the Kabbalists see the world. So where we see challenge, they see intense sparks. And that's the difficulty. That's how they translate difficulty. So why was it so easy for Rebecca? That was extraordinary kindness. That's why Eliezer can't stop asking for kindness. And that's why Abraham is mixed in, because Abraham represents kindness. We keep Isaac out of the picture because Isaac would just make it take longer, because Isaac represents judgment, and judgment represents if you're deserving. And we need kindness for that story because we want to make it happen quickly. That's a different story. The normal is that things take time and it takes challenges. Story in short. Go ahead, Seth, please. I'm sorry.
Hi. I read this from the Rebbe that he sent Adam out of the Garden of Eden because he wanted Adam to figure it out. And
Right.
he wanted, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
He wanted us to figure it out. And that's the purpose of challenge. He created challenge, all of this, so we would try to figure it out. And the only way to figure it out, the simple way, from what I've learned, is to pray. You just pray for kindness, you pray for wisdom, you pray for intelligence, and if you do it enough, the sparks of negativity are gonna fall away or dissipate, and they're gonna be taken over by the sparks of goodness and kindness. And
I think you're right.
that's what Rabbi Akiva and the other Hillel, was it, or whoever?
Hillel's teachers.
he was
Shmaya,
saying to
yeah.
us. Is that the simple way to analyze this or not?
I think so. And I think you're right about prayer, because we're going to run into prayer on the next page. We're going to read about Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder in a minute, and the dream and the ladder. And we'll talk about how the sages understand that to be an experience of prayer. And one of the ways of extracting the sparks is prayer. Not the only way, but it's one of the ways.
So is that the same word as Pintele Yid?
So the spark of the Jew, it would be the same concept. Pintele would be the point. The point means the essence before it's expanded. You have a line, so it's already expansion. Expansion is already my personality, but my core, my essential core, is what the Hasidim would call the Pintele Yid, the dot of the Jew, and that's the essence of the spark. And yeah, so that's the soul. But some of those sparks were inserted in other cultures. But we talk about, I don't want to sit on this all day, but we talk about, I think I said it in the past, I must have said it, that the Talmudic phrase for someone who converted is a convert who converted. And they compare that, they put like, they want to talk about people who were not obligated and then they become obligated. So a child who matured, right? Let's say at a certain point before, let's say, there's some mitzvah that it's relevant. So for example, there's a mitzvah to bring the second Passover if I could not bring the first Passover. What happens if I was not obligated in the first Passover? I became bar mitzvah after the first Passover, before the second Passover. So there's a halacha question: do I have to bring the second Passover? But the second is a substitute for the first, but the first I was not obligated. So there's a whole genre of such questions where I become obligated in the middle of something. Counting the Omer, you have to count 49 days of Passover to Shavuot. What happens if I become obligated in the middle of the 49 days? Do I have to start? Do I don't have to start? There's a whole genre of such questions. But in any case, what are the examples of someone who was not obligated and becomes obligated? So you have a child who matured and a convert who converted. That's the logic. So the mystics look at the Talmudic statement, convert who converted, and they ask a question. Semantically, it doesn't work. If you don't say an adult who became an adult, you say a child who became an adult. So how would you say? You should say a Gentile who converted, right? Not a convert who converted. Before they converted, they were not a convert. You don't say an adult who became an adult after Passover. You say a child who became an adult. So say a Gentile who converted. No, we say a convert who converted. So the Kabbalists say, what does that tell you? It tells you that the soul was always a convert. It's not a Gentile who converted. It was a convert who converted, because that spark was always related to the Jewish people. So it's just that it was sort of in the possession of the unholiness. Why was it in the possession of the unholiness? Well, but according to the Kabbalists, that's the way God gives energy to that negativity. The negative cultures could prosper and could thrive because they have sparks of holiness within them. Now, the goal is to extract the positive sparks, and then what's left over is either this disappears, the kingdom will fall, or hopefully, in many cases, transformed. And the reason it's transformed, the negativity dissipates. Right? Doesn't mean that the culture dissipates, that the negativity, the negative aspect of it would disappear.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting if you think about it, the early Christians, back in 2030, actually, all of their children and their children's children were all Jews.
Yeah.
So they all had the spark
Yes.
of Judaism
Yeah.
within them.
Yeah.
Whether they knew it or not.
Right.
And you can carry that forward through multiple generations.
Right. Right.
If the mother was Jewish.
Yeah.
And the mother was
Right.
a descendant
Right.
of Jewish,
Right.
and
Right.
so on and
So
so forth.
the souls will
Which is
yeah.
an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. So that's some of the ways where the Jewish people will influence the rest of the world through Christianity, through Islam. But ultimately, the sparks come back. So ultimately, when Mashiach comes, you have a refinement, and the sparks of holiness come back, and that's why there's no more negativity, because the negativity could only last when the holy sparks are in exile within the unholy forces.
Aren't there also numerical attributions to sparks in certain circumstances? Like something has X amount of sparks. I remember reading that once, you know.
There's all kinds of, the Kabbalists are into this, that, for example, they talk about, without getting into too detailed here, this was totally not the topic of the discussion, but there's 248 sparks of holiness that collapse and break. And it's alluded to in the second verse of the Torah. So the second verse of the Torah says that the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, and darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the divine presence hovered above the surface of the waters. Hovered, mirachefet. Mirachefet is Hebrew, hovering above. The Kabbalists say the word mirachefet has mem taf. First letter is mem, last letter is taf. That represents mit, dead. In between is resh, ches, pei, 208. 288. I said 48. I don't remember what I said. Reish Peches, 248 sparks that die. Die means it falls down. And that's why it's darkness. All the negativity in this world can happen because there were holy sparks. The sparks shatter and break. They fall down. That's the source of negativity. But the sparks are in the negativity. And what we're supposed to do, and the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters, and the Medrash says that it refers to the Mashiach, without getting into that verse too much. When we correct those sparks who fall down, then we correct the world. That's the doctrine of the shattering of the vessels from the Arizal. He was the first Kabbalist to know about it, if I'm not mistaken. Reish Peches. So the Arizal says, when we left Egypt, it says that a mixed multitude, many people came up with the Jewish people. Erev Rav. Rav, 202. Says the Arizal, when we left Egypt, Egypt was the center of the world, the center of the science, the center of technology, the center of culture. So obviously, many of the sparks were concentrated in Egypt. So when we went to Egypt and we were there for 400 years, we refined 202 of the 288, a very big percentage. That's why, says the Arizal, there's a verse in the Torah that says we're not allowed to go back to Egypt. I know there's Jewish communities in Egypt, so you have to deal with that. But there's a verse, you're not allowed to go back to Egypt.
On a certain path.
That's one of the interpretations. But the verse says, Lo tashub, you should not allowed to go back. That verse says, don't go back to Egypt. Simply means you can't live in Egypt. Without getting into that whole discussion of how people did it is another story. But the simple meaning of the verse is you can't go back to Egypt. Says the Arizal. Why can't you go back to Egypt? Because wherever a Jew is going, it's for a spiritual purpose. If you're in Greenwich, it's because you have a spiritual spark here. This is your part of the world that you're supposed to refine. Your spiritual part is not in Egypt because we already refined all the sparks in Egypt. That's what the Arizal says. Then you have a problem. How is it that in 400 years we refined 202 sparks? And ever since then, from then till now, 3,300 years, we're dealing with what? 86. And we still didn't finish refining them. That seems unproportionate. So the answer is that the small pieces, when you shatter a vessel and you pick up the big pieces, you pick up 90% of the vessel, you pick up in 3 pieces. The small pieces that shatter into small little pieces, that could take a year to find. A year later, I found a piece of glass was left here. So that's the metaphor, that the small ones also break up, harder to access. They're not the low-lying fruit. So it could take much longer. But so this metaphor could be explained very, we can go on and on about this, the doctrine of the breaking of the vessels and the refinement. I don't remember how we got here. Oh, you said the numbers. Yeah. So the reason I was looking in the Torah to find the numbers 248, there you have 202. They came out of Egypt, they extracted 202, etc. Okay, that's the problem with Torah, is that when you start, you end up. We went to Ruth, we went to Edom, we went to Egypt.
But we're coming back.
We're coming back. Eventually, we'll come back.
Just another diversion. Was Shammai a rich man?
Was Shammai a rich man? I don't know. I don't know that he was. I don't know about. Yeah, there's no stories about him being extraordinarily poor. No, I don't think so.
So the Hillel Shammai, I think, wasn't rich versus poor.
No. And Hillel, by the time he became a sage, he was also more established. When he migrated from Babylonia, and Babylonia, it was easier to make a living. Israel was a hard. The economy was difficult at the time.
Wasn't he sneaking up on the roof?
That's the story, but that was before he was very well known. Eventually, he became the leader. There's a whole story how he became the leader. But no, that's how they let him into the synagogue without paying. He couldn't pay the tuition. He had to pay. He was poor, so he went to listen on the skylights. And then it was cold, frostbite. He basically fell asleep there or whatever. He going unconscious there. And then they came in the morning and they saw there was no light because there was no light because he was blocking. So they went up and they saw his dedication. They say, okay, you can come to the study hall. That's the story. But eventually that's when he studied with Shemaiah and Naphtali. And after that, he went back to Babylonia, and then he came back to Israel. And he came back to Israel already after the time of the passing of Shemaiah and Naphtali. And there were certain laws that were forgotten. And because he had the tradition from Shemaiah and Naphtali, they appointed him. There's a whole story that was related to the law about Passover that fell on Shabbat. Gansa Maisa, like they say in Yiddish, how the people who were in charge of the academy, they resigned and gave him the position because they sensed that even though they were more from a prestigious family in the region, he had the traditions from Shemaiah and Naphtali because he was devoted to the learning, similar to the story of Joshua, where Moshe wanted his children to succeed him, but Joshua was the one dedicated to Moshe, so he was the one who held the tradition, held the teachings. So when it comes to a point, a teacher of Torah, it's not about family, it's not about the prestige, it's about the dedication. So that you have an overlap over there.
So there's no backstories of Shammai.
I don't know about wealth specifically. I have to look. I can't say there's no. You can't prove a negative. And in the Talmudic expression, you say "Lo ra'inu ein raya." We have not seen is not proof, right? So the fact that I have not seen something is not a proof that it does not exist. But that's all I can say. Okay, I'm sharing the screen. We're going to read verse 41 on chapter 27. So. Where are we? And the art scroll should be on page 140, 141. Esav 41. Esav hated Jacob. Well, hated is not a strong enough word. 41. Esav harbored hatred. Okay, fine. Esav hated Jacob because of the blessings that his father had blessed him. And Esav said to himself, "Let the days of mourning for my father draw near, and I will kill my brother Jacob." Terrible thing. It seems like he wants to kill his brother, but you see the honor that he has to his father. He doesn't want to cause pain to his father. So even when the Torah says something negative about Esav, which it doesn't usually do, but even when it does, it tells you that Esav excelled exceedingly in honoring his father. So that's the merit for Esav. Rebekah was told of the words of Esav, her elder son, and she sent and called Jacob, her younger son. And she said to him, "Behold, your brother Esav regrets his relationship to you and wishes to kill you. And now, my son, hearken to my voice and arise, flee to my brother Laban to Haran. You shall dwell with him for a few days, 20 years. So that's part of the thing that we said. It's difficult to extract the sparks. There's many other interpretations, but that's the mystical reading that we read this morning. Until your brother's wrath has subsided, until your brother's rage subsides from you, and he forgets what you did to him, and I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereft of both of you on one day? What does that mean? Why would I be bereft of both of you? So Rashi says that Rashi quotes the Medrash that they actually both she was bereft of both of them. The day of Jacob's burial was the day Esav was killed. But that's already the Medrash. Simple interpretation is, if Esav kills Jacob, then she loses both of her sons, right? Because then your son's a murderer. That's not such a good place. So what does she do? She now tells her husband, Rebecca said to Isaac, what would you expect her to say? Esav wants to kill Esav, the son you love, wants to kill Jacob. She doesn't say that. She says, I am disgusted with my life because of the daughters of Chet, local daughters. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Chet like these, from the daughters of the land, of what use is my life to me? So I'm skipping the next chapter, turning the page, chapter 28. So now Isaac gets the message. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. And he commanded him and said to him, you shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself from there a wife of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. This maybe you can understand. He's probably upset at him for stealing the blessings, but his wife said, I don't want him to marry the local girls. He says, go away. Fine. You could barely understand this. Verse 3 and 4 is very hard to understand, as you mentioned many times. And may the Almighty God bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and you shall become an assembly of peoples. And may he give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your seed after you, with you. And may you inherit the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham. This is like extraordinary blessings, the blessing of Abraham after he knows that he stole the blessings from his brother. So this is very difficult. As we said many times, this tells you, however you read the previous story, this ties into those interpretations very, very briefly, literally 30 seconds apiece. At this point, Isaac realizes that Jacob is worthy of the blessing. How he realized that? Either because God let it happen, or some people say even more, because now he realized that it's easy to trick him. And maybe Esav tricked him. And maybe Jacob was more worthy. The bottom line is it's clear that from all these blessings, he now confirms that Jacob gets the blessing, as we discussed many times. We also see here that he gives him the blessing of Abraham. And I alluded to this last week. And I said, I'm going to say it again. Briefly speaking, what's the blessing of Abraham? Blessing of Abraham is you get the land of Israel, right? That's what he says also in verse 4. May you inherit the land of your sojourning, which God gave to Abraham. So you're going to get the land of Israel. The problem is to the land of Israel. What's the cost of the land of Israel? What's the cost? Said it last week. The cost is whoever gets the land of Israel also has to go to exile before. Because God tells Abraham, your descendants will be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years. And after that, I'll bring them back here with great possession. So if you're going to go to Israel, if you're going to get to Israel, you got to pay the price. And the price is the exile. And that's why I said last week, that's why Esav very quickly packs his bags and checks out of Israel. In 20 years, when we're going to come back, we're going to read that he's no longer living in Israel. He's in Edom, southeast of Israel. Even though Jacob is not here, why is he running away? So the sages say he's running away. He doesn't want the blessing of Abraham. The blessing of Abraham has a price. Now, some people say when Isaac sees that Jacob has to leave Canaan, he says, oh, I see that the Gerut, the sojourning, is happening to Jacob. So that was the indication that the divine blessing to Abraham is also happening to Jacob. The fact that he has to pick up and go to exile is an indication that he is the one that is going to get the land of Israel, as opposed to Esav, which at that point was settled in Israel, and he was married and he was settled. Okay, that's one point. Yeah.
Can we also tie it to the prior discussion that, as they say, he needs all the blessings in order to extract those sparks?
Yeah.
Because,
so before he goes, he gives him additional blessing. Correct. Yes, you could say that. And not only he does, but you'll see in a minute God does, and that's going to be part of the story. I don't want to jump ahead, but Vayetze next week, what we're reading next week. Well, I guess next. You know what we can do this year? We could have 2 weeks in a row where we're with everybody else. Because we're with everybody,
Right.
Because we're literally on the border between the two parshas. So we'll talk about it next week. But the point here is that the model of a Jew surviving in exile is next week's parsha, Vayetze. Jacob being away for 20 years. That's the first exile, right? If you think about it, when Abraham went to Egypt, it was for a few minutes. And Abraham is not the Jewish people yet because he has members of his family that did not turn out to be Jewish, right? So Jacob is the first Jew that represents the collective Jewish people, and he is going outside of Israel, and he needs the blessings of his father. And we'll see next week he gets the blessings of Hashem, and he gets the vision, and he gets tremendous blessings. So this is all very important, that before you set out on the journey, you need extensive blessing. And the Kabbalists and the Talmud will tell you that the same thing is with every Jewish soul, because the journey is every soul has the same journey. And before the soul can come down, the soul gets blessing too. We'll talk about it next week. Okay, I still have a few points that I need to say, but I'll take 60 seconds. Seth, go ahead, 60 seconds, and then of course I need the last word. No, I'm kidding.
I
Go ahead.
want you to have the last word.
Go ahead. Thank
Very
you.
important. Every father, no matter whether his child is good or bad, is going to bless him and still love him or
Yes.
her.
Yes.
So he didn't give the blessing for the reason that this says. He gave it because he loves his child. And the child was exiled as a punishment. And really, he has to learn a lesson. I don't agree with, I don't agree with this whole way of thinking that Jacob deserves the blessing, because he really doesn't. And you said Esau went to Edom. He went to Edom, he ran away. He was so upset and scared. And maybe he really didn't want to kill his brother. He knew he was angry. So he said, sometimes when people are angry, they go away and they calm down.
Calm down. Yeah,
And
that's
it's not giving any responsibility to the human being to say that God gives all of this. We are responsible. God gave us the responsibility and to be conscious of our fellow man. He gave us that. It's our choice how we behave.
yes.
And so Jacob is running away too, because he knows he did the wrong thing.
Okay.
And
Seth,
that's why
I'm
this
giving.
is happening. And I'm not trying to be controversial or fight you, because I do love you, but I disagree with the whole way this is being
Okay, I'm very
presented.
happy. I'm very happy that you were able to voice your opinion and present it so eloquently. And
Tell me I'm wrong. I don't care about being eloquent. I want you to tell me I'm wrong.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you made a very good case. And the jury is sitting right here on the screen and in person. And
Well,
I
they
made
all
a
think
case.
I'm wrong.
I made a case and you
That's
made a case, and we all made a very good case. So I unfortunately I can't rehash that right now, but you made a very convincing
My
case.
father didn't want me to go to law school. He said,
You're making
"No."
a very convincing case, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not saying you're wrong. I want to focus on one word in the verse that we read.
Sure, that's a good way to get
And
it.
that's
Okay.
going to be the link between last week's parsha and this week's parsha. And you'll see this theme was going to repeat itself next week as well. What does he tell his son? V'hayisa, God, chapter 3. May the Almighty God bless you and make you fruitful and multiply, and you shall become an assembly of peoples. What on earth does that mean? V'hayisa likahal amin. An assembly, kahal, congregation of peoples in the plural. It's very strange. A kahal represents singular, one congregation. But he says amim, nations. Why does he say nations if he is referring to one people? You'll become a people. No, he says you'll become people. He says you'll become, a congregation of peoples in the plural. So there's a very interesting point that many people say. Let me see who says it exactly. The point is this. The point is that in the last 2 generations of the Jewish people, for whatever reason, without getting into the reason, there was one son who was selected to carry the legacy. And the other son sort of drifted away. You had Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. He had more sons too, but Ishmael does not carry the legacy. He does not become patriarch of the Jewish people. He becomes his own nation. But Isaac is the one chosen to continue to be the patriarch of the Jewish people. Next generation, same story happens. You have Esau and you have Jacob. Forget about who's right, who's wrong, whose fault it is. We're not in the blame business. The reality is that Esau does not become a patriarch of the Jewish people. Jacob does. One child is selected. What does Isaac, this point where Isaac already sees the pain that's happening and that Seth, I think, is identifying with, what does he name what does he tell his child? He says, and this is the new model, he says, Jacob, you will become a congregation of peoples, which means you may have many children. Each child is their own tribe. Each child has their own spiritual path. But all those children, all those peoples or nations will become part of one congregation. And that's what happens. Jacob has 12 tribes, but all those 12 tribes, none of them are rejected. They become an integral part of the Jewish people. And that model changes. And you're going to see also that next week, we're going to see more allusions to this in God's blessing to Jacob as well. But this is sort of the indicator that you see that the shift happens. And this is very important for people to understand because it wasn't said explicitly. So many people believe that that the animosity between the brothers and Joseph was the brothers were afraid that Joseph was beloved. Later in the story, Joseph will be selected and they will be rejected. But that wasn't correct because, like I said, the model changed. Now, like Isaac indicates, we're at the point that we can have many different expressions of the same truth. When you're creating an idea, in the beginning, it has to be very pure, has to be very focused. Afterward, once you have a foundation of 2 generations, then there can be many ways of expressing the same idea. But it seems like first you have to really guard the formula and be very exactly how the formula should work. So to survive a generation or 2, for example, if you have a tree, you have a kernel. You have the kernel idea. You put it in the earth. You're going to smack the kernel in half. Nothing will grow. Then it becomes a little flower. It becomes a little plant. Eventually, as it develops, it could become a tree. It can branch out, and that's what's happening to the Jewish people. So at this time, look at those key words that Isaac tells Jacob when he's leaving to get married. He says, "You're going to have it better than we had it. I became the father of the Jewish people, and my son and my brother did not. Jacob will become the father of the Jewish people. Esau will not. He becomes the father of his own nation, but he doesn't become a father of the Jewish people. With Jacob, it's going to change. You're going to have 12 nations, part of one congregation. That's the big shift. And we're going to get back to it next week when God speaks to Abraham in the vision of the ladder. And many people say that God is really indicating the same thing, alluded to that now all of his children will be part of the Jewish story. So that's the story in short, a lot more to say. Looking forward to next week, because next week, just like this week, everybody is caught up to us. And on Sunday, we're going to learn what everybody's going to read on Shabbat. So it's like we're living with the times, like the Hasidim would say, we're living with the weekly parsha. So that's very good. So thank you all for joining. I'm sorry that we didn't read that many verses and we went all around town, but I hope it was at least somewhat meaningful and enjoyable.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
By the way,